Hello everyone and welcome to C++ tutorials for control, robotics and machine learning. In this lecture we will explain C++ class templates. So let's immediately start. The main idea for using class templates in C++ is to make class definition more generic. That is, we want to define classes whose member functions and variables can deal with various data types and even with other objects. For example, in the so-called standard template library, or STL, we have a template class called vector. Vector template class is used to store dynamic arrays of various types. For example, we can write vector of the type int v1, then vector of the type float, for example f1, then vector int pointer s1. These statements will declare vectors that can store integer, floats, and pointers to integers. Of course, here instead of even basic data types such as integer, floats, you can define your own data types or even your own classes, and you can just put them over here. And that's the power of templates. In this tutorial, through a practical example, we will explain how to define and use C++ template classes. Here's the main idea. We will define a class called toNumbers for simplicity. That is, we will stick to a very simple problem that will illustrate the main ideas of defining templates and using templates. And later on, you can expand this example, or you can use the same principle to develop more complex and more realistic template classes. So here's our class toNumbers. This class will store two numbers that can be of any type. And this type will be defined by the user. For example, I can store floats, I can store integer, unsigned integer, even characters. Okay, then we will create methods that can set, get, and add the two numbers. And here's how the class will look like. We will have the public functions or methods, we will have two constructors, then we will have functions or methods that can get, set, and add the stored numbers. And the private member variables will be first number and second number. So let's immediately start with coding. This tutorial is based on VS Code editor for writing and editing as well as executing C++ files. Of course, you can use some other C++ editor and a compiler. So I will start by clicking on Start, and then I will start developer command prompt for Visual Studio 2022. You can simply search for this in your Start menu, and I will click over here. Then I will go to my folder where I write my code, so I will go to C drive, then I will type cd codes, then I will type cd test code. And over here I will start my VS Code by typing code and dot. And here's my VS Code editor. I will click over here, yes, I trust the authors, and let's continue. So let's open a new file. And over here I will call the file as toNumbers. Let's call it like this, capital 2 numbers.h. And notice over here that actually I'm defining a header file for my template class. Okay, click here and I will store it over here. Create code, and that's it. Good. Okay, let's start with coding. I always suggest to everyone to always include these three commands, or better to say preprocessor commands, to your header file. These are the so-called guards that will ensure that the header file is not included multiple times in other files and in the complete program. That is, we use if not defined toNumbers, define toNumbers, and end if toNumbers.h. So that's it. Simple as that. Let's start with coding. The first step is to include the necessary library. So we will need input-output stream, and we will also need cst dlib. Okay, now we are using namespace std, and let's continue. Let's define our template C++ class. We do it like this. We start with template, then over here we say class, and we can enter an arbitrary name for a data type that this class will store or work with. Usually people denote it by capital T. So what is T over here? Capital T can be integer, can be float, can be character, can be even a defined object, right? And later on in the class, instead of a specific data type, we will use capital T. So this is the first line when defining a template class. To repeat, you say template, this is standard, then inside class, and you give a name to a data type. This is a generic name that your class will store and deal with. Okay, and then we proceed as usual. We type class. Let's call our class 2numbers. And over here, let's start editing the class. We will have public functions or public member variables and private. Over here, private will be 2 numbers that will be stored by this class. Now, what is the data type of these numbers? The data type is generic, and I will denote it by T. Okay, now T is a generic data type, and the variable name will be first number. And similarly, we do this thing for the second number. So I will here T and change this second number. Okay. Now, how about the methods? What do we have? Let's put the default constructor. So this default constructor will set both numbers to 0. And let's just call it 2numbers. Note that the constructor name should match the name of the class. This is very important. Then we will have the overloaded constructor that will actually set these 2 numbers while creating or instantiating an object of this class. Okay, so we will type 2numbers, and over here the first parameter is t_n1 and the second one is t_n2. Note again over here that we are using the generic data type called t. Okay, let's continue. Now, we need another member function or a method that will set numbers, set values of the numbers once the object is defined, is created actually. So I will call this function set numbers, and it is void since it doesn't return anything. And again, we will have the first input parameter and the second input parameters that are 2 numbers. Okay, then what else do we have? Then we need to have a method that will return the value of the stored numbers in the class. I will call this method over here get numbers. And what will be the input parameter of this function? It will be the position of the number. So this p number can be 1, and if it's 1, this function will return first number, and if p number is equal to 2, this function will return second number. So let's write here function to return the values of stored numbers. Okay, and then finally we need the 1, 2, 3, 5th method that will add the number. So let's put like this, function that will add the stored numbers. And let's call this function add numbers. And this function will actually return the sum. So consequently over here, the return value is t. So these are our functions, our private member variables, and this is our complete class. Simple as this. So let's repeat everything. We start the definition of the template class like this. Then inside we have name of the class, we define the public member functions, and private member variables. And that's it. Simple as that. The next step is to define these functions. Now, a standard practice in C++ programming is to separate the class definition from the class implementation. The class definition, or we can also say the class declaration, should be in the header file, and the implementation should be in the CPP file, that is in the C++ implementation file. So we will have two files. One file should be twonumbers.h and another file should be twonumbers.cpp. And this is a standard procedure. However, be careful over here. Since here we are writing a template C++ class, it is suggested to keep everything in the header file. That is, the implementation also should be kept in the header file. By doing this, we avoid potential compiling issues. And I'm not going to go into more details, just remember this. Put the implementation inside and below the class. Of course, there is a way to avoid doing this by basically defining the implementation file and then over here simply typing include that file. However, I'm not going to do that. That is, I will simply, after the class definition, start with implementation. We need to implement all of these functions. So let's start with the first constructor. Now, we need to define constructors as template functions. So again, we need to type template, then over here, class, and the data type, the generic data type, which in our case is t, and then look what we need to do. We need to do this, two numbers, then it's a template class. So we need to write it like this, and then we specify the name of the constructor here. Here it is, and over here we implement that constructor. So the constructor is doing this. It will set the first, let me just copy and paste to save time. The first number will be 0, and the second number will also be 0. So this is our default constructor. Okay, nothing special. So again, how do we define member functions? We start again, template class t. Then over here, look what I did. Two numbers is the name of the class. However, it's a template class, so you need to write this. And over here, we will have two numbers, the name of the constructor. So this is our first constructor. How about the second overloaded constructor? That is this one. So I will simply copy this part over here. And again, I need to write template, then here, class t, then again, two numbers, then t, then I need to do this, and a prototype of my second constructor. So what the second constructor will do, it will do this. It will set the first number to n1, and the second number, oops, here I made an error, you should be careful, this should be 0. Second number is equal to n2, and that's it. Okay, so this is our second constructor. Let's continue with the class, and we need to basically implement this member function. So let's write it down over here. I will write it down here so I can see what I need to type. So again, we need to type template, over here class t, then again this part should be the same, so let's copy it. And what we need to do here, since this function will return void, that is, it will not return anything, we will need to type void over here, and over here we need to type the name of the class together with the input parameters, and let's see what this thing will do. This thing will do the same thing as the second overloaded constructor. That is, this function will simply change the numbers once the object is being created. Let's continue further. Next, we need to implement this function, get numbers. Okay, so let's do that, and let's write it here. So this function, let me just do this. This function should return t. Or better to say, we need to first do this, don't forget this. and then we start. The function should return t. It's the member function of this class, so we need to write two numbers t, and over here we need to specify the name of the function. Here it is. Okay, and then we continue. So what do we write over here? We need to write the following. Obviously, based on this p number, which is a position number, we need to return either the first number or the second number. So we need to do an if statement. So if, let's see, if p number over here is equal to 1, what do? We simply return first number. Okay, then if p number is equal to 2, then again we need to return second number. Okay, let's continue. Next, if p number is not equal to 1 and p number is not equal to 2, we need to return the error. So let's code this. We need to type if, then we'll have parentheses like this, and then in between we will have AND. Logical AND operator is denoted like this in C++. So if p number is not equal to 1 and if p number is not equal to 2, we will simply write a message cout, let's write it down, error, the provided index is not 1 and 2 or 2. This is what you need to do, and then you need to do end line. Okay, and then we will simply return 0. Here there is an issue, since 0 can also be a number, right? 0 can be a number. However, this error will mean that we are actually making an error over here, so the user will know. Okay, and the final method that we need to implement is this one, to add numbers. So let's copy this part so we know what we need to implement. And let's make sure that this one is completed. It is. So again, we need to type this, template class t, and over here we need to write what? T is the return type. Then we will have the name of the class, which is a template right now, and over here we will have this function add numbers. And let's see what is the implementation. We will simply return this. Return, and what do we need to return? First number plus the second number. So let's write it down. First number plus, let's do it, second number, and that's it. Simple as that. And let's erase this. So this is our complete implementation. And let's do this to save space, and let's save. Okay, so this is our complete template class definition and implementation. Don't forget to save this header file. Next, let's write our driver file. Click on File and click on New File, and let's call the driver file as driver code.cpp. And let's click Create File, and let's start with coding. The first step is to include input-output stream. Then let's include CSD let's write it like this, cstdlib, and next we need to include the defined header file. So the header file name is 2numbers.h. Okay, and here it's very important to save the header file in the same folder where this file driver code is also created and saved. This is very important since the compiler will automatically know where the header file is. Otherwise, if you store it in some other folder, you will need to specify the path to that other folder to your compiler. Now, let's define our int main function. Here it is. And, oops, let me do this. And let's return 0 here. Okay, so the first step when you trying to test the code is actually try to compile this code. So let's do that. So I will click over here and I will click Run C++ file, and over here I need to select my compiler. So I will select the second one and let's see what will happen. Hopefully there will be no issues, and you can see over here that there are no issues. This means that there are no issues in this header file and there are no syntax errors. And you can see it over here, since VS Code is very smart and can recognize syntax errors while we are typing. Okay, so let's start creating the objects of our class. So to create objects of the defined template class, we need to type the name of the class. It is 2 numbers. Then over here, we need to specify the type. So let's go back to our header file. You can see this generic data type T. When we are creating the object over here, we need to specify the precise data type. In our case, let's start with integers. So now, compiler will know that T is an integer over here, okay? So this is very important. So let's now call our, for example, object pair number, and let's put, for example, 3 and, for example, -1. Okay, so let's see, will this thing work? How to test this? So let's, for example, first of all, print the values, right? So let's get the first number, pair number. Oops, you have to be careful here, pair number. And then let's call the function get numbers, and let's get the number at the position 1, and let's do end line. And let's do the same thing for the second number to make sure that the second number is stored. So let's click here, run file, and see what will happen. And we can see 3 and -1. Click here on problems to see. And here there is something saying that over here, not all control paths return value for this one, get numbers. Okay, this is very important and we will investigate this later on. Okay, now let's go back to our file. So there are no compile errors. This is simply a warning from the compiler. And let's run this code again by specifying different numbers. For example, let's do -5 and 7. Let's run it. And let's see what will happen. -5 and 7. So it works very good. Okay, so let's see what will happen if we specify some position that doesn't exist. Pair number, for example, position 5. We don't have 5 numbers that are stored. However, let's run this and let's see what will happen. Error. The provided index is not 1 or 2. So we get an error if we specify any number over here, which is very important. So it looks like that our class is working. Let's do one final test. Let's see the sum. Let's write down here pair number, and let's call the method add numbers, and let's simply call it like this, and let's write a message. The sum of 2 numbers is, and over here we will simply print the sum. So let's run this. Okay, you can see the sum of 2 numbers is 2, since -5 plus 7 is equal to 2. Now, let's see the power of template classes. Notice over here that we defined a template class that stores integer numbers. However, we can define a template class that stores float. So over here, instead of integers, we will simply type float. And over here then we will type pair number float, and let's store, for example, 3.2 and minus 1.4, and let's test this. How to test this? Well, again, we need to do couts, so we will type cout, and let's do this pair number float. Let's call the method get number, and let's get the first one, and let's see the output. And over here let's do the same thing for the second one, and let's see the output. Let's run this, and you can see the first one is 3.2 and the second one is minus 0.4. And finally, let's sum them together to make sure that everything works. So I will simply copy and paste this one. I will call pair number float dot add numbers and end line. Simple as that. And let's run this code. Save first so we can run it. Another approach for running this code is to simply click over here, run, and run without debugging. And so let's see what will happen. Let's press C++, and you can see the sum of 3.2 and minus 1.4 is obviously 1.8. Okay, so to summarize, in this video tutorial, we'll learn how to write C++ template classes. The idea of C++ template classes is that we can define a generic class whose functions and member variables can operate with generic and user-defined data types. Here's an illustration. We define a class that stores two numbers. Over here, we use the same definition of the class in two cases. First case, we store integers. Then in the second case, we store floats. And you can see that everything works perfectly. Okay, that's all for today.